Good morning, ladies. We're going to be looking at course companion for production costs and revenue, and specifically we're going to start to look from page 13 in your course companion, and we're going to start to look at the law of diminishing returns and returns to scale. The first thing we're going to look at is the content that the specification suggests that you should be able to understand as far as this subject area is concerned. And the first thing is being able to understand the difference between the short and the long run in terms of returns to scale or diminishing returns to scale. So short and long term or long run are two things that you need to be aware of. Excuse me. Also, the difference between marginal, average, and total returns, and that's something that we'll look at as we go through this section. And there will be some simple calculations that you will need to do based on watching some videos, but also then using some information to help calculate you, or help you to practice calculating marginal, average, and total returns. We're then going to look at the law of diminishing returns and define that, and also ask you to do a little bit of research into diminishing returns and the whole principle behind it and where it all comes from, where the original theory comes from. We'll then look at returns to scale, and then move on to look at the difference between increasing constant and decreasing returns to scale. So three different concepts there: increasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, and decreasing returns to scale. And you should be able to hopefully understand the law of diminishing returns and returns to scale, and to explain the relationship between inputs and outputs as well. And that's something that hopefully will become clear as we go through the presentation in a bit more detail. Okay, finally then, you should also be able to understand that there are relationships between returns to scale and also the costs of production. So to some degree, what we're looking to do is to try to find a means by which a firm is able to reduce its cost of production to the lowest point it can. But at some stage after that, you also get what's known as the law of diminishing returns. Some of you may be familiar with this as a concept, and obviously we'll look at this in a bit more detail as we go. Okay, so first things first then, law of diminishing returns. So if we're looking at page 13 in your booklet, we talk a little bit about the difference between the short and the long run, and one of the things that we suggested is that in the short term, certainly in terms of economics, in the short run, you've got a difference between fixed costs and variable costs, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are as we go through this presentation. But in the long run, basically the fixed costs that might stay the same for a period of time can actually change, and so as a result of that, in economic terms, in the long run, all costs are variable, and that's something. All factors of production, the costs can change, or those factors of production can be changed in terms of the scale or the size of your premises or whatever that might be. And so all factors actually become variable in the long run. So let's take a look at what this law of diminishing marginal returns is then. Okay, sometimes known as DMR, as a shortening, and basically it suggests that if a firm adds a number of different variable factors together whilst holding the inputs of one other factor fixed, say something like capital, there will be a stage at which those returns will actually start to diminish from the variable factors. So in essence, one could argue that as you increase the total output, you will actually get a smaller improvement in those factors of production, and in fact in some cases you might actually get total output that might start to decrease, and that basically is when we're talking about the cost of an extra item of marginal output, and another extra one on top of what we've done and produced previously, that will then start to fall. Okay, So there is a video that I'd like you to take a look at. There is a link here, as you can see, which basically talks about and demonstrates the way in which the thing that we actually showed, to be honest, in lots of ways, when we were doing the paper chain example back at the start of this booklet. But there is a link there that I'd like you to take a look at, and basically it explains a little bit about the way in which, when we get extra workers involved, then effectively we might get to a point where we start to get the law of diminishing returns being applied. Okay, so the link actually is a live link on the presentation, but also on page 14 in your booklet, the top of your booklet, there is some information there that I'd like you to, well, the link is there, and you'll need to actually watch the whole video and also use that to fill in the table on page 14, which essentially includes numbers of workers, total product, marginal product, and also average product. And there are some formula that you can apply to calculate what the marginal product is and what the average product is. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll give you some time. I'll sort of take a break, if you like, from the presentation, or you can stop the presentation at this stage. Take a look at the video, use the information that you're going to be provided in the video to actually do some calculations, and also to explain a little bit more about this principle of marginal product and an average product, and the difference between the two. So the link that I mentioned is just here, as you can see. So you can click on that one, and that will take you straight to the YouTube link that I want you to watch. And then the information that you can glean from that, you will need to use in page 14 in that table, and also when you come to plot the information on pages 15. And also on 17, you might, or sorry, not so much on 17. That's something else slightly, but certainly. I'd like you to draw up the diagrams which plot the information that you're going to use from the video on page 14. Okay, so as I mentioned there, complete that table in the course companion, and make sure that you do some of those calculations based on what the marginal product cost would be, or the amount of extra product that we would add if we added another worker, and also the average product, which is the total amount of product divided by the amount of labour. Okay, so the table that we talked about, I'm assuming that you've gleaned the information from the video, but as you'll see, basically the info is how I'm going to fill it in for you, and we can talk through what any of those issues might be. I'm just going to move the image of me slightly so you can see the table slightly clearer. So in the first instance, then, if we actually take a look at this table, in the first case, we've got the number of workers, and the variable input in this case is the number of workers. And to start with, we've got one worker. That one worker is actually producing 500 products. And fundamentally, if we then take a look at the difference, well, in this case, there isn't a marginal difference in this sense, because obviously we've not added another product to what that one person has produced. So in this instance, there is no difference between the total product and then the taking away the difference of that one extra unit, or the change in the total product divided by the change in labour. Okay. If we then take a look at the variable input changing, so we've now got two workers. Our total product is now 1,500. And in this instance, we can see that the marginal product, which is the cost or the amount produced by adding one extra factor of production, in this case is the difference between 1,500 and 500, and so in this instance the marginal product would be 1,000. When we look at the average product, though, excuse me, We'll just go through and show the rest of these, which actually includes, as you can see, a range of different values, right the way up to eight workers. And you can see that at this stage, or if we take a look at each of these different stages, there is a point at which we start to produce less. So when between 7 and 8 workers, effectively, we produce less than we did previously. But you can see there is a sort of trend in terms of the figures, in terms of adding one extra variable in terms of our workforce, and then the difference that makes to the overall amount of product that is produced. So obviously adding one, in this case, one extra factor of production, which is in this case labour, that is the difference that it makes between the original amount from in this case, if we look at this one, the original amount of total product that was produced by 3 workers was 3,000, but when another was introduced to make a 4th worker, then we're producing 4,000 in total. So we've got a marginal product increase of, in this case, 1,000. Okay. Now, when we then look to divide or calculate what our average product is, we basically take the total product produced and we divide it by the amount of labour involved. So in the first instance, the total product was 500, and we've divided that by 1 to get 500. If we take a look at the second example, then we've got the total product of 1,500. We've got 2 workers, so we take the 1,500 and divide it by 2 to get our average product of 750. And you can see this then follows through. So in this, so if we talk about the third instance, where again we're still improving the amount of product that we're producing and increasing the amount of product we're producing by adding an extra resource. In this instance, obviously that then changes our average product to 1,000. So that's taking 3,000 and dividing it by the 3. You can now see that at the 4th point, the average product actually is pretty much the same as what we had with the third worker being added. So in this instance, although we've added significantly to the total product, the actual average product per worker has is the same as the previous value. And then when we start to take a look at the next stage, again the total product produced is slightly higher. Again, we've got 500 extra units produced by the 1 extra unit of labour. But in this instance, you can see that when we take our average product, which is taking our total product and divide it by the number of workers, it now is starting to fall. So that goes to 900, goes to 792. At 6 workers, 679 at 7 workers, and 563 when we're talking about 8 workers. So that actually is demonstrating the point quite nicely, that the situation starts to become a position where we start to get diminishing marginal returns, in that we're not producing as much as we would expect by adding another worker, and that's partly to do with efficiencies and people getting in one another's way and it not being quite so productively efficient, I suppose. Okay, so that table there is the table that you would need to complete on page 14. And then also there are some questions there explaining what marginal product is. Why does the second worker add more to the output than the first worker? And this is actually also partly explained in the video, so it's worth just watching the video quite carefully and taking some notes to help you understand that principle. Okay. Now, once you've got that table completed, what I'd like you to do is take a look at the 2 graphs on page 15, and I'd like you to then plot those values that you've got both in there. So obviously in the first instance, we've got the total product only that we want you to show the calculations for, and then we've also got the marginal product and average product plotted. And obviously if you're going to do that, it probably makes sense to do that if you're going to put more than one item on on a graph, it probably makes sense for you to do that in different colours, so that it makes it slightly easier for you to understand that when it comes to looking back at that in the future. So I'm going to give you a bit of time just to do that. And if you like, I'd stop the video here and then have a go at completing those tables on page 15. Okay, so let's take a look at what those questions how we might have answered those questions in the first instance. Okay, in terms of explaining marginal product, marginal product is basically the additional output resulting from the addition of one unit of input. In this instance, the input we were talking about clearly was an extra worker, so an extra unit of labour, if you like. If we take a look at question 3, why does the second worker add more to the output than the first worker? Main reason is that we can allow for some specialisation because you can divide the work up. Capacity is going to be better utilised. Maybe idle machinery can be start to be used more effectively when you've got the extra worker who can, again, if you remember the paper chain exercise, it showed quite clearly that when people tended to specialise, that then improved the whole process. However, why does the marginal product fall with the addition in this case of the 8th worker? Well, obviously in the first instance, we've got workers that might be getting in the way of each other, and they may need to wait to use capital equipment, and that obviously might then cause inefficiencies to start to develop. Okay, so those are the responses to the questions on page 14. Let's have a look at the graphs then. Again, I've assumed that you've tried to complete those graphs independently, but basically this is what each one looks like. Okay, so we've got our total product graph here showing that effectively we get to a point where we start at 500 for one worker, and you can see there's a steady increase all the way up to the point where we get to around about 7 workers. So the total product being produced is increasing really right the way up to 6, starts to sort of bottom out at 7, and then when we get to the 8th worker, you can see that this is starting to decline. Okay, when we then look at how the marginal product and the average product is shown, you can see that there is a significant spike in the marginal product from 1 worker up to 3 workers, where if essentially we're getting major gains in terms of overall productivity for the extra unit of labour from 1 through to 3. But you can then see that from 3 onwards, pretty much we start to get a decline. We're still getting an increase in total product, but effectively the amount of extra product that we're getting or extra units produced that we're getting for adding extra workers is starting to fall. So so the marginal product obviously is then demonstrating that we're starting to get a fall going on. Excuse me. So if we then look at the total product at this point here, then so we've got the total product maximum point. It corresponds with the point at which the marginal product, if we take a look at the marginal product, reaches 0. Okay, so effectively, like we said before, if we're going to profit maximise as a company, what we're going to do is we're going to produce to the point at which marginal revenue and marginal cost are the same, essentially. So where we're getting no extra gain for that extra element of marginal product, then that's the point at which we would, that by demonstrating, by drawing this line here, this shows you that that's that point there where we're talking about the highest point in terms of our total production maximisation is at 7 workers. But you can also see that at 7 workers, that when we go past 7 workers, then we start to get marginal product actually reducing somewhat. Okay, so there's some quite interesting correlations to be borne in mind as far as that's concerned. Okay. You can see that the marginal product here cuts the average product at its maximum point, and that essentially implies that where marginal product is greater than average product it will still be rising, and that obviously makes a reasonable amount of sense, doesn't it, if you think about it. So if marginal product is greater than average product, then clearly when we then calculate average product, which is taking the total product and dividing it by the amount of labour used, then that obviously is another thing that we can glean from that particular graph. And obviously in this instance, if we get the opposite happening, so if marginal product becomes less than average product, then average product will also start to fall. Okay, so from what seems to be a relatively simple set of graphical information, that you can take quite a lot of information from that. Okay, and obviously if you need to just sort of break that down and take it step by step, then obviously stop the video, have a think about it, and then obviously move on and look at the next thing. Okay, let's have a look at some other DMR questions then. Okay, so we've got that question where, well, question 5 was completing the diagrams to show total product and marginal product and average product. But if we talk about what actually determines the number of workers that are employed, well, to some degree, the existence of diminishing marginal returns will, to some degree, stop us from just adding more workers. So in this instance, we certainly wouldn't want our marginal product to start to become negative, i.e. anything above 7 units. There's very little point in changing that variable to add another person to the labour force, because fundamentally we're actually producing less, and we're producing at a less efficient level than we would have been doing so if we'd have stayed at just 7 workers. Okay, let's have a look at the relationships that we've established then. Okay, so there is obviously a relationship between total product and marginal product, and obviously that relationship is that when you've got total product rising, then marginal product is going to be positive. And obviously on that basis, if we then consider that if we've got an increase going on, if we've got total product, that's going to be rising more quickly, because of this increasing marginal returns due to specialisation. Okay. However, if we get to the point where that starts to fall, then total product is going to rise more slowly, and that's going to be due to the fact that we've got this diminishing marginal return scenario happening, where we've effectively got issues around overcrowding, idle workers, and clearly not being as efficient as we would ideally like. And when we get to a situation where total product is falling, that obviously means that marginal product must be negative. And in that instance, that's obviously going to have an impact on the marginal product, and also an impact on the gradient of the total product too. And then if we take a look at marginal product and average product, when we get a situation where marginal product is greater than average product, then average product is going to rise, and the higher marginal product will sort of drag up the average product, because essentially for all the time that marginal product is rising, that is then having a positive effect on average product. So that's obviously something to bear in mind. Okay. When we get to a situation where marginal product is less than average product, then average product starts to fall, because the lower marginal product drags down the overall average product. Okay, and that's all fairly obvious stuff, really. It's sort of just interpreting the information that's been provided to us in a graphical format. And in this instance, you've got a situation where the marginal product, it will cut the average product at the maximum point. If we go back and take a look at that previous graph where we sort of drew in the construction line to demonstrate that point. Okay. So a little bit of work there, graphical work, just an interpretation of graphical work. But also, what I'd like you to do as a bit of a self-study activity on page 16 and 17 of your booklet, which just talks a little bit about the principles of the law of diminishing marginal returns and the law of diminishing returns in particular. And it was actually first suggested by a gentleman called Reverend Thomas Malthouse. And basically, there is a couple of articles that I'd like you to just have a read of, make sure you're familiar with the content, and also then have a go at answering those questions. So on page 17, you've got questions on what did Malthouse predict would result from population growth? Why did he have why did these predictions not yet come true? And also, do you think that this theory was wrong? Okay. So obviously, one of the issues that we talked about specifically is this principle of marginal product and average product over the last sort of few minutes and those last few slides. But fundamentally, the thing to remember is that marginal returns of labour are in addition to total output brought about by adding one or more worker to the labour force. But it does assume that we're holding all other factors of production fixed. Remember, we talked about changes on the margin and also assuming that everything else stays the same, so that we can see what effect a change in one of the factors of production might have on the overall efficiency of a business. Okay. And then we've also got a couple of examples on page 84 of the Powell booklet, which gives you a couple of diagrams that you can add to your course companion, which actually demonstrate those quite nicely for you. Okay. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to save this down to the narrated PowerPoint for you to take a look at during tomorrow's lesson. And what I'll do is I'll add another one in when once we've gone through this one and worked it through it together over the next lesson or so.